Welcome to the Flat Track Factory. Today we're going to do something a little different. We've had some viewer questions, so I've decided to gather up a couple of them and answer them. Stick around. Alright, Flat Trackers, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch these videos. I'm kind of surprised that it's been successful as it has. I've always asked you to write your questions and comments down below, so I've been getting more of that, and I've got several questions, so I thought I would, instead of just answer them individually, make a video, and maybe more people would be able to get help from some questions, because I think that many of us have these, particularly when we're starting out. And I appreciate your time given to me to watch this stuff, and I'd like to give back a little bit to you, get more people racing flat track so the sport can continue to thrive. So, number one, what's the difference in riding experiences between brakeless framers, DTX, twins, singles, etc.? Wow, that's a big one. They're all totally different, but exactly the same. They're all a motorcycle. They have two wheels, and it's about weighting the front on the way into the corner and then transitioning to the two wheel in the middle of the corner, picking the throttle up and weighting the rear on the exit. And all the body English stuff is the same. A brakeless framer, I had to think about this for a while. I've never ridden one. I've raced without brakes multiple times, but never on purpose. I have ridden 1949 Indian Arrows, which may be a video coming out on that shortly. But those bikes are rigid tails and do have brakes on them, but the track sizes that I've raced them on, I've raced them 3 times now, the need for brakes was almost none. And I think some of the faster lap times was just simply arcing into the corner on a 5th mile, and really no brakes were used. Then of course I mentioned a couple of times I had brakes fail. Actually, I won a regional in Sturgis Half Mile. It was a very narrow blue groove, I don't know, 2 or 3 feet wide. In the summer, I believe that races are typically in August. This is when I was a junior, and won a regional simply by getting a good start and very carefully easing into the corner and making the entire lap about precision and exit. And there was a bunch of frustrated guys behind me, but I got a good enough drive on the way out of the corner to keep the bike on the groove on the way in, and then did good lap time by high corner speed and good exits. So this is what I found works on the 1949 Indians Arrows, where we don't really use any brakes. Also on the Mad Dog class, Mad Dog stock, Mad Dog mod, that's the XR100 flat track class. The lap time on these bikes is often best with using no brake at all. So I have ridden without brakes, but as far as a brakeless framer proper, I have not done that. But it's all kind of the same. A framer, for those of you who don't know, they call the DTX bike, the modified motocross bike. I guess they called it a DTX bike, and what I grew up calling a flat track bike is now called a framer, a purpose-built frame flat track motorcycle. They've somehow made that into the word framer. So a framer, well, they are typically more compact, a little bit stiffer suspension with a little bit softer chassis. The DTX bikes are motocross driven, and I find them to have a very stiff chassis, and I haven't ridden them a whole lot for various reasons, but one of them is I kind of don't like them very much. They just feel strange to me, and I think the stiff chassis with the longer wheelbase gives me a different feel. They do work very well, particularly people that have grown up riding them, but I'm just of the generation where I had enough time on framers that that's more where I have more experience and I'm more comfortable with it. So what I feel as the stiffer suspension with a softer, more flexible frame versus the DTX bike, which has a very stiff frame, and then I want to try to get some flex, so I kind of run a little bit softer relative to the frame bike. So there's some differences there. Also, the wheelbase difference. The DTX bike is noticeably longer, and it does feel a little different because of those things. Ultimately, we all ride on the same tire, so that does give a broad similarity. The other thing about the DTX bike that I feel uncomfortable with is if you don't have some heavy modifications done to the steering, like the triple clamps, the steering lock is less than a framed bike, and that makes me uncomfortable. I like to have the safety margin of, if the bike gets very, very sideways, to be able to have more steering lock to gather that back up, where the DTX bike runs out of steering lock, and I feel like I'm risking a high side, so I don't enjoy that. The 450 based flat track motorcycles have a relatively light crankshaft. This gives a different feel. They have a very short stroke compared to what I'm used to would be 750 twins and the 600 generation of Rotaxes, which have a relatively longer stroke, a bigger, heavier crank, more inertia in the crank. They rev naturally slower, and that makes the motorcycle handle a little differently. Also, those motorcycles produce more torque, a higher torque curve over a broader band. If you were to look at the dyno curve of a 450, their torque curve might be peakier, whereas like a Rotax or a Twin has a flatter torque curve where you can have almost an electric-like feel, and I like that. That's another security feature and something I'm used to, where the bigger crank, flatter torque curve bikes you can basically adjust your steering with your throttle, and that's a very comfortable way for me to ride. That's what I'm used to. That's what I enjoy. So the 450s make a power in a peakier way, and I don't particularly care for that. But again, they can be ridden very, very fast. It's more of a stylistic or a preference thing, I would say there. The twins, the 750 twins, I've ridden the XR750, the Honda RS750, Kawasaki parallel twin 700s, and the Stroker big crank 750s. And I would say those, compared to what I just mentioned, they are a little bit heavier. They feel very similar to a framed bike in that the chassis has a little bit more flex, and the suspension, I like that a little stiffer. So that's similar to the framers I was just describing. Also, it has the broader torque curve where, again, that rear steer can come into play. Typically, until recently, we ran them on bigger tracks, so I sort of associate them with the bigger tracks, the longer, heavier, slower steering you get once you kind of get over 100 miles an hour. So that's kind of how I would describe that. They do have there's a heavier motorcycle, so it takes more input. It seems like it takes a little more time to lean them off the side of the tire, or onto the side of the tire from the top of the tire. So those are some differences there. So what does he expect differently? I'm sorry, what would one expect to need to do differently on these other types of machines? Well, as I mentioned about the brakeless bikes or riding with no brakes, you tend to focus on what you can do rather than what you can't. So that would mean trying to maintain a more consistent lap speed, where you would want to scrub off as little speed as possible. So maybe a little bit of a wider line, swooping into the corner a little more, because you can't dive in, whip the bike on the brake, and shoot out quite so easily. So there's different riding styles it would use for certain bikes. But really, some of the people that I've raced with um, just ride so incredibly differently that I think that the variation in the rider is way more than the difference in the motorcycle. For example, Davey Durrell is just a smaller person. He rides the bike in a different way than a very tall person would ride a motorcycle. They just fit on the bike differently. I've also raced with Shayna Texter, a very small person, actually distractingly small. The first couple times I was on track with her, it seemed like that shouldn't be happening. It sort of reminded me of Davey Durrell, and they move on the bike differently. So that's really not what you're asking, but I was just thinking through this as I was speaking, that the motorcycle itself, there are differences, but we all ride them so differently. I think that we're a bigger factor. And once you get enough get enough seat time and do enough laps, the differences in the motorcycle are relatively small compared to things like the track and conditions and things of that nature. So another question, history. Where did this awesome sport come from? Well, I'm not really a historian. I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak on that. I have been to the Barber Museum and have read books and talked to people, and my understanding is it probably started the instant the second motorcycle was built. Probably raced around the field, and then I think there was velodrome bicycle style tracks, high bank tracks, and maybe they co-opted them. But the bottom line is some of the earliest images of oval flat track or oval motorcycle racing, the track wasn't anywhere flat at all. It was super high banked wood track, sometimes in 2 miles in length. Gotta Wikipedia that, because it almost sounds unbelievable to see a super high banked wood track 2 miles in length. The pictures are quite amazing. And that was extremely dangerous. From things that I've read, I think people were killed by splinters, actually. Many spectators that stood at the top were also killed. So there's a lot of danger in that type of thing. Then, of course, fairgrounds were all over the United States. This is in the early 1900s. And horse racing and or car racing was done at these fairgrounds. So that was an easy way to race a motorcycle. And then, of course, it was picked up by various sanctioning bodies. I think it kind of started at a national series in the 30s, and then maybe another version in the 50s. And then, of course, it's changed hands several times, and that kind of brings us to today. But that's definitely a good wiki trip if you like to dig into reading about history, to check that out. Steel shoes, how are they made? Are there different styles, types, materials to consider when acquiring them? Yes, there is. And I actually have a video, I think it's called Protective Equipment for Flat Track. And there is a section, about a 3 or 4 minute section in that video discussing this specifically. But I'll touch on again here quickly. There are different styles. When I was a kid, Ken Maley made my first shoe. I actually got to meet him and have him work on my shoe at the track. It was kind of cool. He's sort of a legend. And he had several different types of shoes, a mile, a short track, etc. And I don't really remember what he made for me, but I liked a little bit more of the curve in it, and I just would use it on all of the tracks. And I don't know today that the guys that make them currently, I don't know that they necessarily have different styles of shoes, but that would be an interesting question to ask them. They all look vaguely similar to me. Also, the boot that you give them tends to drive the shape of the shoe. And I have very particular opinions on that. And if you'd like to see more of that, check out that Protective Equipment for a Flat Track video. Different materials. People have tried different materials. Titanium sparks, and I think that's frowned upon. And I tried carbon fiber. But really, the bottom line is you need something that is extremely wear resistant and won't crack. And I think that ends up being like a mild steel type of body with the hard facing. I think Stellite is the brand they use. And really, people have tried other things, and other things just don't work. They are a very craftsman-like, artisan-like piece of kit, and making one for yourself is just not a good idea. There's a ton of things that go into them, and making one correctly is very important. So that's that. Beginner's tips, common mistakes, etc. Yes. Yes, I've actually addressed this in sort of a subtle sort of way by producing a couple of different videos. One of them was protective equipment. One of them was our engine and suspension guys worth it, and another was the XR100 video. Those are things that I think beginners really need to think about. Getting too much motorcycle in the beginning, when the motorcycle overwhelms you, is one mistake. That's closely related to spending all of your budget on hot rodding the engine because you need more power, when maybe you need more lean angle and more mid-corner speed because beginners aren't even getting on the gas for more than a split second. So those are two mistakes right there, and not having the proper protective equipment, because you're going to fall off, and it's a little more likely in the beginning. Also, I think there's something to crashing. I think it's a learned skill, and you should be prepared for hitting the ground in the beginning. That means having elbows, shoulders, back, chest, hips, knees, all of these protruding areas I think should be covered up. This style of wearing a motocross jersey only, I think you're just really asking for trouble that way. How to read a track? Well, that is a lifetime of experience. The first thing that you should do, in my opinion, is start a database of measuring the track. And I have a video on that too, about how to use Google Earth. You also can get to the track and use a wheel, a measuring wheel? Forgetting the right name for that tool. But measuring the track so you know how big it is, and then other factors will be the grip level of the track, the banking level of the track, but getting some data on it is the first thing that you need to do. Then walking the track is another thing, because your perception of the track is warped when you're standing on one end and looking at the other, and also undulations, holes, weird surface irregularities. These types of things are best seen slowly, so you can spend 15 or 30 minutes, depending on how big the track is, going around the track and figuring it out. What to expect, what to look for, weird things like that that you maybe wouldn't see on Google Earth or just standing in the pits looking one time. So then throughout the night, things are going to happen depending on type of the dirt. Some dirt changes more than others. Sometimes the water goes away. Sometimes when the sun goes down, it comes up. So checking that out continually is something that you need to do throughout the night, and really throughout your career, because this stuff is very complicated. There's a lot to it. It's easy to forget. Things change. They change dirt, add chemicals, things of that nature. But walking the track and scuffing your foot on the track here, there, and the other place to just get a sense of what it feels like when the sun's up, and then after practice, and then as the sun goes down, it gets slipperier, etc., etc. These are all things that you need to look at. Also, you need to see where the holes are, and inevitably you'll find that you find a good line that you really like, and then somebody's in it, or a hole develops in that spot. So you also need to look at 2 or 3 options, your A option, your B option, and a C option for where you need to go. When there's somebody in your way, or your line is no longer fast, or ends up having holes in it. So that's that. Suspension settings. I've got a couple questions about particular suspension settings, and I kind of don't really want to answer those because I think that's kind of personal. It can be confusing. I've been doing this a while, and I have some peculiarities, to say the least, in my riding as well as personally. But I think that should be best given to a suspension specialist. And again, I touch on this in a video called engine and suspension, are they worth it? So take a look at that if you want to see kind of why I think they're worth the money. But really, there's guys out there, they're super nice. They'll probably help you over the phone, answer a couple of questions for free. But really talking to them and sending your suspension to them to be either completely gone through with new springs and all that, or just refreshed. Remember, suspension wears out. If you bought a bike from somebody else, I'll bet you a hot dozen Krispy Kreme donuts that the suspension's worn out and it needs to be gone through. The oil gets beat up, the seals break down, the pressure and the shock leaks out. All of this needs to be looked at, and it's a great time for a suspension pro to get in there and make sure things are in the ballpark, and they can help you with a good base setting. Tire differences. What are the differences in tires? I just did a tire video on the new Dunlop that came out, and I made some references to Dunlop being a stiff carcass and others are a little softer. And what are those? Basically, the Dunlop is the stiffest one that I'm aware of the true flat track racing tire. And typically the way that works is a stiffer tire takes a lower pressure. The softer, more flexible carcass tires take a higher pressure. And I think if you go look up some of the sources as to who will tell you what tire needs what, you'll find that those two things track in that way. So I am my particular settings, the way that I do things is I stick with the Dunlop only. That many people do that. Also, many people also like to chase this tire on this night at this track, and some of my competitors even will try 2 and 3 different tire brands a night. I find that to be distracting. I have various databases of what works where, and I kind of stick with tire compound and pressures, and I adjust those in the Dunlop, and other guys swap tires back and forth and do all of this sort of stuff. So I find that to be distracting, confusing, and I've had a fair deal of success running with the guys that chase the tire all the time by adjusting it in that way. So your mileage may vary on all of this, but that's how I've done it. So that's probably good for this one. If I probably won't promote this video necessarily. I'll just post it up for the subscribers and see what happens. If you like this sort of thing, ask some more questions. I'd be happy to answer some more. Thanks for watching.